The rain poured down in heavy sheets, turning the city streets into glistening rivers of light. Inside his old but reliable taxi, Rajesh kept his hands steady on the wheel, squinting through the blur of headlights and reflections bouncing off the wet pavement. It was late, too late for most passengers, but he had one last ride left in him before calling it a night. As he pulled up to a red light, something on the sidewalk caught his eye. A small figure stood alone, barely visible under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. A child, soaking wet, shivering, and looking completely lost. The boy couldn't have been older than 6 or 7, and his tiny hands clutched a school backpack as if it were the only thing keeping him safe. Rajesh hesitated for a second. He had seen all kinds of things in his years as a taxi driver, but a lost child, alone in the dead of night, was not something he could just drive past. Rolled down his window and leaned over. "Hey kid," he called gently. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The boy looked up at him, eyes wide with fear and confusion. He didn't answer. His lips trembled. Whether from the cold or from fear, Rajesh wasn't sure. The rain dripped from the boy's messy hair, his clothes soaked through, clinging to his small frame. Something about the way he stood there, silent, frozen, sent a chill down Rajesh's spine. He glanced around. The street was empty. No frantic parents, no searching eyes, no signs of anyone looking for a lost child. "Do you know your house? Can I help you get home?" Rajesh tried again, keeping his voice calm, careful not to scare him. The boy hesitated, then gave a small, hesitant nod. Rajesh reached over and unlocked the door. "Come on in, I'll take you home." The child hesitated for a moment before climbing into the back seat. He was drenched, leaving a small puddle on the worn leather seats, but Rajesh didn't mind. He turned up the heater and handed the boy a dry rag he kept for wiping the dashboard. "Here, dry yourself a little," he said. The boy took it, but remained silent, eyes darting nervously around the taxi. Rajesh could feel the tension in the air. Something wasn't right. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to break the silence. The boy swallowed hard before answering in a quiet voice. "Aman." "Okay, Aman. Do you know where your house is?" The child nodded but didn't say an address. Instead, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a small crumpled piece of paper. Rajesh took it and saw an address scrawled in shaky handwriting. It was in a neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, far from where they were now. How had the boy ended up here alone? Rajesh didn't ask. He simply put the car into gear and started driving. The rain pounded against the windshield as the wipers struggled to keep up. Inside the car, the only sound was the humming of the engine and the occasional sniffle from Aman. Something about the whole situation felt strange. A weird child alone at this hour, in a place far from home. There had to be more to the story, but Rajesh knew better than to press. He had learned long ago that sometimes people just needed help without a dozen questions. As the taxi moved through the darkened streets, Rajesh glanced at Aman through the rearview mirror. The boy clutched his backpack tightly, his fingers gripping the straps like a lifeline. His wide eyes stared out of the window, watching the rain blur the city lights. They drove in silence for a while until Rajesh spoke again. "Your parents must be worried sick." Aman flinched, his hands tightening around the bag. For the first time, Rajesh noticed how pale the boy's face was, how his lower lip quivered, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, fear. Rajesh didn't push further. Instead, he focused on the road, navigating through the quiet streets, following the address on the paper. But a feeling lingered in his chest, an uneasy feeling that this wasn't just a case of a lost child. Something else was going on. Finally, after nearly an hour of driving, they reached the neighborhood. It was quiet, the kind of place where the streetlights barely worked, and the houses sat close together, their dark windows watching like silent eyes. Rajesh pulled up to the address and looked back at Aman. "We're here," he said softly. The boy didn't move right away. He stared at the house, his small hands trembling as they gripped the backpack even tighter. Then, slowly, he turned to Rajesh, his voice barely a whisper. "Will you come with me?" Rajesh frowned. He wasn't expecting that. Most kids would have bolted out of the car the moment they saw their home. But Aman, he was afraid. Rajesh hesitated only for a moment before nodding. Of course. He stepped out of the taxi, the rain still falling lightly now, and walked with Aman toward the house. The front door was slightly ajar, a warm light spilling out onto the porch. And then, before Rajesh could knock, the door swung open. A man and a woman stood there, their faces filled with shock, relief, and something else. Something Rajesh couldn't quite place. "Aman!" the woman gasped, rushing forward and pulling the boy into a tight embrace. Tears streamed down her face as she held him close. The man, who Rajesh assumed was the father, looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. Rajesh felt a strange weight lift from his chest. Whatever had happened before, whatever fear Aman had been carrying, he was home now, safe. The mother turned to Rajesh, her voice shaking. You brought him back to us." Rajesh nodded, offering a small smile. "He's a strong kid, just needed a ride home." The father stepped forward, his eyes filled with something intense. Gratitude, yes, but there was something more. "You don't understand," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just bring our son home, you saved him." Rajesh's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" But before the man could answer, something unexpected happened. Something that would change Rajesh's life forever. Rajesh stood there, rain dripping from his jacket, as Aman's father fixed him with an intense gaze. The words echoed in his head. "You didn't just bring our son home, you saved him." Before Rajesh could ask what that meant, Aman's mother turned to her son, gently cupping his face, searching his eyes as if making sure he was really there. "Where were you, Beta? How did you get so far from home?" Her voice trembled. Aman hesitated. His small fingers clutched the hem of his wet shirt, and he glanced nervously at Rajesh before lowering his eyes. "I got lost," he murmured. The mother looked at her husband, something unspoken passing between them. The father exhaled, rubbing his face with his hands before turning back to Rajesh. "Please come inside. You should hear this." Rajesh hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He wasn't sure why, but something told him this was bigger than just returning a lost child home. The house was warm, a stark contrast to the cold rain outside. Rajesh took a seat on the worn couch as Aman's parents sat across from him. The mother still held Aman close, as if afraid to let him go again. The father finally spoke. "We've been looking for Aman since this afternoon. We searched everywhere, called the police, asked neighbors. We were losing hope." Rajesh frowned. "But how did he end up so far from here?" The father glanced at Aman, then back at Rajesh. His face was tight with emotion. Aman wasn't just lost. Someone took him. Rajesh stiffened. "Took him?" The mother's grip on Aman tightened. He was at school, waiting for his uncle to pick him up like usual. But instead, someone else came. A stranger. He told Aman that his parents had sent him, that there was an emergency at home and he needed to come quickly. Her voice broke. "Our son trusted him." Rajesh's heart pounded. He looked at Aman, whose eyes were glued to the floor. The boy had been tricked, and then, somehow, he had escaped. How did you get away? Rajesh asked gently. Aman finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. They put me in a car. I didn't know where they were taking me, but I knew it wasn't home. He paused, gripping his backpack tighter. The man left the car for a little while. I unlocked the door and ran. I ran as fast as I could. Rajesh swallowed hard. He pictured the small boy running through the streets, scared and alone, in the rain. The thought sent a chill through him. The father exhaled shakily. He must have run for miles before you found him. If you hadn't stopped. He shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. Rajesh let the weight of those words settle in. If he had ignored that little figure on the sidewalk, if he had just kept driving. He looked at Aman again, this time with even more admiration. This boy had been through something terrifying, yet he had fought to find his way back. Did you see the man's face? Rajesh asked, keeping his voice calm. Aman hesitated, then nodded slowly. A little. He had a big scar. Here. He traced a small finger along his cheek. The father ran a hand through his hair, frustration in his eyes. The police said they'll look into it, but these things, they're hard to solve. No cameras, no clear description, just a child's memory. He sighed. We just thank God he's back. Rajesh sat back, his mind racing. This wasn't just an ordinary story of a lost child. This was something much darker, and yet there was still something missing, something that didn't quite add up. Aman was home. He was safe, but Rajesh couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The mother suddenly turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. You were in the right place at the right time. You saved our son. Rajesh shook his head. Aman saved himself. I just gave him a ride, but the father was looking at him with a serious expression. You don't understand, he said again. You did something we can never repay. Rajesh didn't know what to say. He wasn't a hero. He was just a taxi driver who had done what any decent person would do. But as he looked at a man who was now leaning against his mother, eyes drooping with exhaustion, he felt something shift inside him. Before he could respond, the father stood up. Wait here, he said, disappearing into another room. Rajesh watched, confused, as the man returned with a small envelope. He held it out. Please, take this. Rajesh frowned. What is it? The father hesitated, then pressed it into his hands. A token of our gratitude. Rajesh opened the envelope, and his breath caught. Inside was a stack of crisp bills. More money than he had seen in a long time. Enough to pay off debts. Enough to change things for him. He looked up, stunned. I can't accept this. The father smiled, but there was a deep sincerity in his eyes. You didn't just help our son, Rajesh. You helped us all. This is the least we can do. Rajesh looked at Aman, who was now watching him with sleepy eyes. He thought about his own struggles. The endless long nights driving, barely making ends meet. And yet, something about this felt too big to accept. His fingers tightened around the envelope. He had a choice to make, and whatever he decided would change everything. Rajesh sat there, staring at the envelope in his hands. The weight of it felt heavier than just money. It carried gratitude, trust, and something else he couldn't quite place. He had spent years struggling to make ends meet, pushing through long nights behind the wheel of his taxi. But never had he expected a moment like this. I don't know if I can take this, Rajesh said slowly. Looking up at Aman's father, the man gave him a knowing smile. I understand, but sometimes fate brings people into our lives for a reason. You were meant to find our son. And this is our way of saying thank you. Rajesh hesitated. He had always believed that kindness should come without expectation of reward. But then he glanced at Aman, who was now curled up in his mother's lap, his breathing slow and steady, safe, alive, and he realized this wasn't just about the money, it was about trust, a connection between strangers that would never be forgotten. With a deep breath, Rajesh nodded. "All right, thank you." The father's face relaxed, and Aman's mother smiled softly. "You have no idea how much this means to us." Rajesh slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket, but before he could stand to leave, Aman stirred, sat up slightly, blinking away sleep, and looked at Rajesh. "You won't forget me, will you?" the boy asked in a small voice. Rajesh's heart tightened. He smiled gently. "Never." Aman reached into his backpack and pulled out a tiny keychain. A simple plastic taxi, slightly worn from being held too much. "Here, for you," he said, handing it to Rajesh. Rajesh took the small keychain, running his fingers over its surface. It wasn't expensive or fancy, but in that moment, it felt more valuable than anything else. "Thank you, Aman," he said sincerely. The boy smiled sleepily, his eyes closing again as exhaustion finally took over. Rajesh stood, giving the family one last nod before stepping outside. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and fresh. He took a deep breath, feeling something inside him shift. A sense of purpose. A quiet understanding that this night had changed him. As he drove back through the empty streets, the city, lights reflecting off the wet pavement, Rajesh reached into his pocket and pulled out the small keychain. He placed it next to the meter, letting it rest there, a reminder of a night he would never forget. And as he continued his shift, picking up strangers, listening to their stories, and taking them where they needed to go, he realized something. Sometimes, the biggest journeys aren't just about distance. They're about the people we meet along the way.